Yes, welcome back to the Tuer News Show on See Today. Now you're watching the signature segment of the Tuer News Show on See Today, which is the See the Stories. And some time ago, our reporter Chiara Mediana has interviewed Andrea Nguyen, a Vietnamese author who's living in America.
Right, and Andrea is a Vietnamese-born American teacher, food writer, cookbook author, and chef living in San Francisco.
Wow, the Bay Area. Now, she's also an expert on Asian cuisine and cooking method. Nguyen has written numerous cookbooks about food from her native Vietnam. So let's have a look.
Well, thank you so much for the interview. This is absolutely exciting. And so let's get into it. And the amazing thing about cuisine is how much a cuisine can actually tell a lot about a nation's history. So what can you tell us about the Vietnamese cuisine's history?
And so the first Vietnamese cookbook, my first book, was a big book. It was called Into the Vietnamese Kitchen. And in that book, I had 175 recipes, and pho and banh mi were very central because, they illustrate so much of what Vietnam is. So there are 3 dishes that I call sort of like the gateway drugs for people to love Vietnamese food, to fall in love with them. So first is gỏi cuốn, the rice paper rolls. The second is banh mi, the sandwich. And the third is pho, the noodle soup. The thing with banh mi that's interesting is that it illustrates the colonial aspect of Vietnamese cuisine, right? And so we've had so much interaction with people from different parts of the world. And so many people assume that Vietnamese food is heavily influenced by the French when they take a look at the banh mi sandwich. But the thing is that the Vietnamese, yes, had the French in Vietnam for a certain period of time, and they were able to bake this bread in a really difficult tropical climate. Anyone who has tried to bake bread in Southeast Asia knows how hard it is. But the Vietnamese, with help from Chinese bakers, were able to figure it out. But they, at first called it bánh tây, which means like French bread or Western bread. But after a while, when it became really popular and an everyday food, they were just like bánh mì, bread made from wheat. And they really kind of took it upon themselves to make this sandwich their own. And so when you take a look at what's inside the banh mi sandwich, it is very unusual with the pickles and the vegetables and the different kinds of meats. And yes, there's pate and sometimes there's butter, but the pate has Chinese five spice in it, and sometimes there's char siu pork, and sometimes there's vegetarian versions with tofu. So after a while, it's not a French sandwich, it's a Vietnamese sandwich. And that's very Vietnamese because people think oh, well, the French introduced that. It's they were sort of there as a consequence, a situation that made this food. Same thing with pho. People think, oh, it's related to pot au pho, the French, dish where you're boiling beef and vegetables and stuff. And was well, the French liked a lot of beef. They started killing cows, and Vietnamese people were those are animals that were typically used as workhorses. But, people were oh, they're all of these scraps. And so they put them together and used spices that were, popular in that part of Vietnam. And they're very similar to Chinese spices that are used, star anise and cinnamon and whatnot. And they served them with rice noodles. And so even though the French, by circumstances, made all of this beef available, the Vietnamese cooks and the Vietnamese Chinese cooks put it together into something called pho. So it's wholly Vietnamese and wholly owned by Vietnam. And I think that, so many cultures in Southeast Asia that have experienced colonization, part of what people have done over the centuries to simply, maintain their identity is to do that cultural appropriation and to take this foreign ideas and make it their own.
Right, but when it was brought to the United States in the 70s, how far was the transformation goes? And was there any alteration perhaps to the recipe of these Vietnamese dishes?
So when Vietnamese people, so many people, like tens of thousands of Vietnamese refugees fled Vietnam in 1975 and after that. And when you come to the United States, it's the land of plenty and everything becomes bigger. All the portions are bigger. And a lot of the foods that were brought from Vietnam came from the southern part of the country because Vietnamese were escaping from Saigon. And the southern part of Vietnam, the flavors tend to be kind of sweet and portions are bigger. So if anyone who travels to Vietnam now and eats pho, for example, they will notice that in Hanoi, where pho is very traditional and where pho originated, the portions are small and you don't get a lot of herbs and you don't get tons of meat. You don't get many choices. But when you come to the United States or to Australia, where there's just so many more resources, the sizes, the portions are huge. And the flavors tend to be kind of sweet because here in the United States, over the decades, people have gotten used to that kind of sweet flavor. So even when a Vietnamese restaurant says, oh, we're serving Northern style pho, I go in there and I eat them like, but it's kind of sweet, and not salty like it is in Hanoi now and before. So there are these kind of interesting differences that get played out. But when my family first came here and through the 1980s and 90s and up until the early 2000s, we didn't really have the luxury of talking about regional differences in Vietnamese food outside of our homes. Because we were just like, well, you don't just get the rice paper rolls and the banh mi sandwiches and the pho. If you can get that, like, oh my goodness, that's so exciting.
Right, but in terms of the development of Vietnamese cuisine, do you see, are there any rising in Vietnamese contemporary cuisine, or it's more like Vietnamese fusion cuisine?
I think that there is both going on. So there are young people who are now becoming professional chefs and restaurateurs in America, and they are Vietnamese. So in the past, you would have Vietnamese immigrants who came to America, and let's say they were doctors or lawyers in the old country, but they came here and they couldn't not continue their careers anymore. But what do they know but food? So they would open restaurants. So that is a matter of opening a restaurant and cooking because they have to. But now with this new generation, they are becoming professional cooks by choice and becoming restaurateurs by choice. And many of them are also trying to reach back to the foods of their upbringing because they want to understand those flavors, honestly, before their elders die. So they're really working hard to maintain, those traditions. But at the same time, they're like, I want to do something a little different because I'm not my mother or I'm not my grandmother. They want to pay homage and to respect the legacy of their families, but they also want to push boundaries. So I see a little bit of each happening. There are Vietnamese chefs who are being nominated for prestigious national awards, such as in the United States, we call the Beard Awards, the James Beard Foundation Awards. And I see Vietnamese names every year, last year, this year, and it makes me so incredibly happy. I think that there's so much going on in the world where we think that our ideas and our flavors will become more fusion, and there's nothing wrong with the word fusion because new ideas come out of fusion all the time. But it's always important for us to think about what got us to where we are now so that we can move forward with a solid foundation of knowing where our past is. And I think that that's always important to me to remind myself and also to remind other people, because it's easy to play with food and create something cool and new. But what's important is knowing where you came from and the foundation for those flavors.
All right, so now let's talk about your coveted book, The Vietnamese Food Any Days, which, you know, by description, you said that this is a cooking hack your mother adopted after fleeing from Vietnam to America. And how can that book reflect the situation then?
So much has changed since then. And when I started writing Vietnamese Food Any Day, our supermarkets are much more well stocked. Not perfect, but good enough so that you can go in and you can make a lot, you can buy ingredients and make very, very good Vietnamese food. Because essentially, like if you have fish sauce and rice, the produce and the proteins and the tofu, the rest is pretty, readily available now. And so that book is an homage to my mother and people of her generation, in the sense that they came here and they made food with what is available to them. And there was nothing exotic about it. They just were trying to figure out ways to feed their families. So they would get on the phone and they would talk to each other, when the phone rates were cheap. And way back then, you didn't have cell phones. And so you had to wait until you can make phone calls to people late at night. And they would share all of these ideas. And they would be making discoveries at the American supermarket. And so, I reached back to that notion of how do you make an adventure out of this? But it's not that hard nowadays, because our supermarkets here in the United States are extremely well stocked. And I think that really speaks highly to the currency of Asian culture right now.
How significant the success of your books in popularizing Vietnamese cuisine, particularly in America?
It's very difficult to statistically measure something like that, but I will tell you this, that that was my 6th cookbook, and many people have cooked from the beginning to the end of that book and prepared all the dishes, which to me is stunning, because I thought I would be the only person who ever would prepare all the recipes in that book, and there are about 85 of them. So as a cookbook writer, just like if someone were to make an album of music, okay, you would be happy if someone listened to one song and maybe they would sing it back to you, right? Because it's stuck in their memory. So for me, as a cookbook writer, I would be happy if someone favorited 2 or 3 recipes, and they would make it over and over again and make it part of their repertoire. But when people say to me, oh yeah, well, I've made every single recipe and I can tell you that it's really great. Or during the pandemic, this couple, they were dating long distance, and they would get together once a week to cook something from my book. And eventually they got married. And so it's they fell in love and they tried their relationship out on my cookbook. And so they're just making that human connection, and me realizing my gosh, this is how people have embraced Vietnamese food wholeheartedly. And these are not Vietnamese people who are telling me these stories.
Right, on my last question, this is about your latest book that is upcoming, The Evergreen Vietnamese Cookbook. And then it says that it strengthened the philosophical aspect of Vietnamese cuisines. But what can you tell us about that? And how is it linked with a sustainable lifestyle that is growing right now?
I started out wanting to write about vegetables because I love vegetables. And I had a health scare in 2019 when I realized that my body needed to really change in terms of what I consumed. And I was, as someone who had to travel a lot and do a lot of restaurant eating and oftentimes combining foods that really should not be combined. I realize that over time, it's like you really shouldn't do that, and especially as you're aging. And so when I turned 50, I decided to change my diet, and I decided to focus more on vegetables, and I ate healthier, and I felt much better. And I thought, oh my goodness, it was such like a wonderful discovery. And I went and I reported all of this to my mother because I was having such a good time making all these different wonderful Vietnamese dishes with vegetables and replacing things and becoming not a full-fledged 100% vegetarian or vegan, but I was eating just a lot more vegetables, let's say like 75, 80% vegetables. I went to my mother, I talked to her about it, and she said, well, seems like you look much brighter and, happier. But we used to eat like that all the time in Vietnam. And it was at that point that I realized that I was just returning to my food roots, because so much of Vietnamese food is rooted in plants. Let's take a look at like a bowl of pho. What's in there? People tend to think of it as meat, but the rice noodles, that's made of rice. And then there are all of the aromatics and spices that help to build the flavors of the broth. The meat is there, but really it's like the vegetables really kind of like make those flavors of what we know as pho. And as soon as I started thinking about that, I was like, oh God, it's really about the vegetables. And so much of our cultures on this planet is agrarian based. That's why we have festivals that celebrate rice season and harvest season, because we're so relieved that the work is over, so we finally have time to rest. And all of these things, just reinforce in my mind that I needed to celebrate vegetables and how Vietnamese people utilize vegetables to amplify their role. So that's why I wrote Evergreen Vietnamese. And at first I thought, oh, well, these are evergreen ideas, meaning they're ideas that are enduring or everlasting. But then when you think about it, and I started really like cutting down on the amount of meat that I eat, so that it's a really low meat book. And I am a flexitarian, meaning I, sometimes eat some meat and sometimes I don't. But when I started doing that, it's just a much more sustainable way to eat. Because if we don't, and we won't be able to get everyone to cut out eating meat, but if we all ate a little bit less, we will all be super much more responsible for the future of this planet.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having us, and good luck with your book, the Evergreen Vietnamese Cookbook. We are looking forward to read it here, and have a nice day.